Hello and welcome. I'm Maria Ressa. This is Rappler Talk. Joining us today, what an interesting day this has been so far, is Malcolm Cook. He's at the Southeast Asian Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore. He's also a former professor at Ateneo de Manila University. Malcolm, thanks for joining us.
Hello and welcome.
Thank you.
I'm just watching our stream. You can watch us on Facebook and on YouTube and on Rappler. So Malcolm, what a day! President Obama canceled his scheduled meeting with President Duterte. What do you make of this?
Yeah, I think it shows that Duterte has a lot to learn quickly, moving from being mayor of Davao City for so long to president of the Philippines and representing the Philippines internationally was always going to be a steep learning curve, and Obama reminded him just how steep it is.
What triggered this? I mean, from what you said, there were reports of what he said the night before. Your reaction to his statements before he left Davao?
Yeah, I think it shows a problem for him of dealing with the media and the language he uses. Whatever he says now as president won't only be heard in the Philippines, it'll be heard internationally. And his love of the use of colloquial language has got himself in trouble already with the U.S. ambassador, who he called a son of a whore as well. And now he's used it for the Philippines' most important partner and the world's most important political leader. The fact that his spokesperson came out quickly with a printed statement saying that he was misunderstood is a small sign. But if you look, Duterte probably only has one other chance to meet President Obama before President Obama steps down, and that's in APEC in Peru if President Duterte decides to go to Peru and if President Obama does as well. If not, he's lost his one chance to meet President Obama.
Does the Philippines lose anything by having this meeting canceled?
I think it doesn't lose as much because Obama's on his way out, but it does show, as the international media coverage of Duterte today and previously shows, it does lead to growing international bemusement with the new president and his approach to his duties. So I think the longer Duterte raises eyebrows, not only in the Philippines, but internationally, particularly using such language, the bigger that problem will be to address. So not short term, probably not too much damage, apart from a bit of embarrassment. But if it continues this way, I'm sure his minders and the Department of Foreign Affairs in the Philippines might be a few gray hairs there today.
President Duterte is very proud of who he is and has actually said that he's not going to change for the presidency. His supporters, Martin Andonar, the spokesman, also says that they can't change this president. So what do you think will happen? I mean, will he be able to change the presidency, or will he be forced to change to the norms of diplomacy?
I think, when President Jokowi was elected as a town mayor in Indonesia, he went through this kind of learning curve. He's Javanese, so quite softly spoken, whereas Duterte comes from Mindanao. And if you look, Jokowi, who didn't like diplomacy when he started and thought ASEAN wasn't important, has over his couple of years in office kind of grown into the office of the presidency. I think Duterte will only change if Duterte thinks it's in his and the Philippines' interests. But I think the evidence is mounting that if he wants to be listened to outside of the Philippines, he should change the way he speaks to the rest of the world at least.
It's so interesting that President Duterte has actually met with China a number of times since taking office. How do you read the changing dynamics between China and the United States and the role the Philippines plays in the region?
Yeah, if you look, certainly that was a key feature of the Aquino administration from 2012 onwards. Of course, Aquino came to power in 2010, wanting to have better relations with China, including not sending the ambassador to the Nobel Prize ceremony for
Correct.
Liu Xiaobo. But then, after Scarborough Shoal was lost, Duterte clearly wants to move back to a kind of approach that was probably adopted by Macapagal Arroyo of trying to have some type of equal relationship between China and the U.S., focused on China's potential economic interests and benefits for the Philippines. So I think he's trying to rewind the clock to 2012 or maybe even pre-Aquino time. World has changed since that, though, so it's going to be difficult.
And what impact will this have well, this is actually also the first time that the world leaders are meeting after the ruling at The Hague.
Yeah, I think it's very clear that at least among ASEAN and probably on the broader stage, President Duterte and Foreign Minister Yassa don't want to focus on the 12 July ruling as a regional issue, but want to maintain it as a bilateral issue, a very significant change of policy from the Aquino period, I guess because they're still hoping for substantive bilateral talks with China in the near future. The fact that there was 17 years of bilateral talks before the Philippine decision to go to the tribunal suggests that might be wishful thinking.
Are you optimistic about where the bilateral talks with China could lead?
I'm worried that we often misread the South China Sea and China's interest in it, as the recent reports in the Philippines, including on Rappler, about Chinese barges in Scarborough Shoal and the potential of building Scarborough Shoal into a Chinese military facility. I think China's primary interests in the South China Sea are military and not diplomatic, and hence bilateral talks with people like Fu Ying or even the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs won't change what the Chinese military interests are in the South China Sea. So I think there's a bigger game being played between the US and China in the South China Sea, and the Philippines is not part of it, and China won't change its approach to Scarborough Shoal or the West Philippine Sea in general.
Is this redefining global dynamics of these two superpowers?
Yeah, because now China has, as of last year or this year, a sea-based nuclear deterrent against the United States, so can threaten the U.S. homeland with nuclear weapons from anywhere, theoretically, in the Western Pacific. The United States has to respond to that. The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement is a key part of that. So without a doubt, the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea are now a major arena of U.S.-China military competition, and that will likely only grow. So countries like the Philippines that are littoral states will be under pressure from both sides. I think that's how the world is different than when Macapagal Arroyo was president. Correct. And Philippine China had their golden moment.
If you could give advice to our Department of Foreign Affairs, to President Duterte, where is the best place for the Philippines to place itself in this? It's almost like a proxy low-intensity conflict between two global powers.
Yeah, I think the Aquino administration did well of leveraging its relationship with the United States to improve the Philippine side of its disputes with China and the West Philippine Sea. The United States is not a party to those disputes, but has interests. So if I was the advisor, I don't know who President Duterte's advisors are, I would think that's a good way. And also, given that the 12 July ruling was so comprehensively in favor of the Philippines, I would wait for China to reach out on bilateral talks instead of the Philippines looking like it's the one desperate to restart talks.
In terms of ASEAN now, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, because this is the meeting that President Duterte is headed to, his first glimpse of the international stage, right? What do you expect to come out of these meetings among world leaders in ASEAN?
I think many ASEAN watchers and ASEAN wallahs will be relieved, because certainly under President Aquino with Foreign Secretary Del Rosario, the Philippines pushed ASEAN, a consensus body, hard to take firm positions on China's actions in the South China Sea. President Duterte has already said he's not going to do that, and Foreign Secretary Yassa didn't do that earlier when the foreign ministers meet. So in that sense, the new administration in the Philippines makes it easier for ASEAN not to appear disunified and split. So I think that's the key one. But the East Asia Summit, with the Japanese, Chinese, Russian, American, and Australian leaders as well, that's the really big game in town. And Duterte has started particularly badly on introducing himself to that stage. It's not clear who else he's going to meet.
Let's talk about President Duterte and what you're seeing from Singapore. I mean, he won with 16 million votes in a field of 5. He had certainly more than a clear majority, and he has very avid supporters. What do you make of his victory as president? It's less than 100 days since he's taken office.
I think he's trying to do very quickly most of what or everything he promised as a candidate, from the peace talks with the communists to approaching the Moro issue in Mindanao differently to carrying on this very firm war on drugs. So you certainly can't complain that he's not doing what he was trying to say. I think there are growing worries that he does have a particularly personalistic approach to power, so doesn't necessarily use all of the different organs of the government as suggested in the Constitution, and does seem to be very sensitive to perceived criticisms, particularly of the war on drugs, and reacts often at 2 a.m. at press conferences in ways that are surprising and out of the norm. So I think there is support for what he's trying to do, and people are giving him the benefit of the doubt, but the longer that the doubt isn't addressed, the more that'll be problematic.
It's interesting, again, the focus so far of his first few weeks in office has been the war on drugs. And you're talking about roughly since July 1, more than 2,446 people killed at the end of last week. And yet it's quite a muted response from the Philippines, which took a very strong position on human rights for a very long period of time. What do you make of this?
Yeah, I think, I guess there's a difference between taking strong positions on human rights violations elsewhere that you're not party to versus those that taking in place in your own country. And that's certainly the Duterte's administration's response to any outside criticism. It's an internal matter. The fact that the Pulse Asia poll showed after the first week of his government such strong support also, I think, mutes criticism within the Philippines, given he's viewed to have very strong popular support, and mutes any criticism coming from foreign governments. I think Duterte's very strong political position in the Philippines is muting criticism all around, as well as his very harsh reaction to what he perceives as criticism, even if it's not really criticism itself.
He's always surprising, for sure. I mean, so do you expect this honeymoon period? Do you expect this lenient kind of look at his actions to last more than the 100 days?
Certainly, I think within Southeast Asia, Southeast Asian governments are very wary of making comments on what's going on in each other. That's core to the ASEAN. Domestic criticism, that's a different question, particularly, as you say, as the number of deaths mount, and clearly some people have been killed who are neither drug lords or drug users. So I think if criticism is going to come and be effective, it'll be from within the Philippines, not from outside. I think criticism from the outside, particularly from Western sources, may actually be counterproductive.
That's interesting. In terms of the terrorism, I know that security is one of also the key issues you look at it. There was a weekend bombing last Friday night in Davao. What do you make of this and the president's reaction, the government calling for a state of lawlessness?
Yeah, so the fact that it happened in Davao City, the political bailiwick of the president himself, is clearly very provocative. And if it is the Abu Sayyaf, they've said yes and no, then clearly they've drawn a line in the jungle, so to speak, and you'd expect the government to react very strongly. Previous governments have committed to killing and destroying the Abu Sayyaf with very limited effect. The Duterte administration is going to try to do different. If you look at the national emergency, though, it was a bombing in Davao, and yet it's a national emergency with as far as I understand, an indefinite time period. So that's a worrying sign when one action in one part of the Philippines leads to a state of emergency, a constitutional extreme measure for the whole country. So again, for those worried about how Duterte approaches the limits of power, the state of emergency is probably yet another point of concern.
It's interesting. The business community, though, is still taking a wait-and-see attitude. Is that correct?
Yeah, and came out again. I think many people are in favor of the goals of what he's trying to do, both in the war on drugs, as the Chief Justice Sereno mentioned, and in trying to finally lance the evil of the Abu Sayyaf when it comes to the means of how his administration is approaching that and their communication of it. That seems to be where the disagreements are.
Let me throw a question from social media. This is from Twitter at Bong Phillips. What happened, this is on South China Sea, and what happened when Arroyo agreed to partner in China in the seismic survey of the West Philippine Sea? We were conned. What do you make of his observation?
Yeah, I certainly think both that was deemed at least constitutionally questionable, the joint exploration agreement signed between Macapagal and China that Vietnam then joined again. And then there were strong rumors that the Chinese kept the seismic data of the resources in the Philippine exclusive economic zone to themselves. So that is not a good example of how to do effective joint development. And I'm pretty sure any Philippine administration, including the Duterte one, hopefully will have learned that lesson.
It's interesting. I mean, let's focus on ASEAN, the last part. What do you expect the key issues? So it started with a bang, if you can call it that, with President Obama canceling the meeting with President Duterte. He instead is going to meet with South Korea's president. What do you expect? What issues will take up the leaders' time?
Yeah, I think within the ASEAN meeting itself, the 10 Southeast Asian leaders, they're going to try to focus on economic integration issues and the so-called ASEAN economic community, particularly because Laos is the poorest and most isolated economy in Southeast Asia and isn't a landlocked country, so doesn't have any national interest in the South China Sea. So I think they'll try to keep focused on economic issues and issues of common agreement like disaster relief. The East Asia Summit, where the Japanese Prime Minister and the US President are there, along with the Chinese Premier, that's probably where there might be more disagreement on Chinese actions in the South China Sea and West Philippine Sea and more kind of strategic fireworks. So if I was a journalist, I would be watching the East Asia Summit more closely than the ASEAN meeting.
Interesting. I'd love to ask you, we're watching the campaign and the elections in the United States here and seeing something similar to what happened in the Philippines, which is the rise of Trump, the rise of a leader who actually says things that you don't normally say is not socially acceptable, right? Let's connect this to how people are also using technology, which is social media, the unleashing of the anger and the impact on political systems and democracies. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think one of the big shifts, and Duterte is a very good example, along with the Brexit campaign in the UK, is the traditional sources of elite opinion and so-called the gatekeepers, including people like you and me, are no longer playing that role. And in many ways, whatever the elites say are read the opposite by a large number of people who feel that they've long been ignored but now can have a louder voice. Duterte clearly won by being the most effective claimant to the anti-establishment mantle in the Philippines, which he deserves. So I think that's the kind of fracturing of how people make their opinions on collective national interests is changing very rapidly, and the institutions from universities to governments to traditional media are far behind in their response to that.
This fracturing of society, the gates of the gatekeepers have crumbled, and there are groups that are using social media far more effectively than the traditional power brokers, right? There was a New York Times article last week that talked about how these Facebook pages, the political partisan Facebook pages, are actually shifting the public opinion. What's the best way to make sure that political discourse remains on track in this new environment?
Yeah, I think it's extremely difficult. So I'm not sure there's a good answer to that. I think one problem that many of the traditional institutions make is there's a generation problem where the
Yes.
older you are, the more gray hair you have, the more authoritative you think you are, but the less likely you're able to navigate this new social media. And to be fair, many of the traditional elite sources have, and I would include academia and people like myself, talk down to the large population saying, I know better than you, hence you should follow me. I think we have to change that hardwired approach if we want to get traction in this new media environment, or new environment for how people identify themselves as citizens as well. So the traditional sources of authority have a lot of self-reflection to do if you want to remain authoritative and not increasingly irrelevant.
No, interesting. Let me bring you back to China and the U.S. Again, a pivotal time, I think, and unfortunately or fortunately, ASEAN may not actually address this head on now, right? You said earlier that the China is looking for a military and not a diplomatic solution necessarily, that there's a bigger game being played. How do you see China? What does China want out of this, and how do you see them playing it in the coming years?
Yeah, I think if you look at the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea, it's pretty clear that China sees that as their maritime backyard and wants much more control over it, both in relation to the Southeast Asian states that are much weaker, like the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and more generally. And the United States, for over a century, has had a commitment to global freedom of navigation as they define it. So there is a very strong disagreement on principles between China and the United States, with the South China Sea as the arena where that difference is being not played out but becoming obvious. So I think this is the early days for a new role for the South China Sea and its impacts upon all Southeast Asian states, with the Philippines being a frontline state, whether they like it or not.
And the Philippines is a frontline state. And do you see, you said early days, but how do you see China and the United States playing this, facing off in the South China Sea now?
Yeah, I think what we've seen over the last few years, this growing focus of the United States for freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, and China's, at the moment, rhetorical reaction to those will likely continue. The 12 July ruling ruled that some of the features China controls, like Mischief Reef, don't have any territorial seas. So
Yes.
The United States may have freedom of navigation operations that float much closer to those key Chinese installations. So as I said, last couple of years of growing strategic concern in Southeast Asia about U.S. and China competition in the South China Sea and West Philippine Sea, I think that's not going to change. If it's going to change, it's going to grow, not diminish. So we're in a new, more worrying period where Southeast Asian states, whatever they do, will have less influence over their strategic environment.
That's worrying. The July 12 ruling at The Hague was a huge victory for the Philippines by getting the economic exclusion zones, basically having these small atolls returned to the Philippines, right? In terms of we talked about this before, but in terms of the next step you would like to see. So now the Philippines, it's not quite using it in terms of bilaterals with China yet, but there are other participants, claimants to the South China Sea. What next step should the Philippines try to do in ASEAN to try to perhaps get a more united front?
So I agree with the general argument that Foreign Secretary Yasai used at the somber press conference after the ruling, that don't taunt China, because China clearly sees the ruling as very unfavorable to them, as does Taiwan. But I think if I was in the Department of Foreign Affairs or in Malacanang, if you look at the ruling, it doesn't only clarify that the Philippines has no exclusive economic zone conflict with China. That's the same for Indonesia around the Natunas, and for Malaysia and Brunei. So the 12 July ruling, if countries abide by it, removes a lot of the areas of dispute between China and other Southeast Asian countries. So, but Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei's response to the 12 July ruling has been very muted.
Tepid.
Um, yeah. So if I was in the Philippines, I would talk with them about how the 12 July ruling favors all of our positions, and for that matter, any ASEAN discussions on codes of conduct. So I think there's a collective gain being not taken advantage of here.
Fantastic. And then, of course, there's a straight out, it must try to find some kind of solution with Vietnam, right? Which has been the most aggressive in pushing back against China. There's a question from Twitter. Let me just throw this to you. At Dabs of K asks, do you think it's just Duterte's style to gain sympathy from China and get them, therefore give back South China Sea to the Philippines? Is it a psyops game?
I think if you listen to Duterte, he sees that he is a deal maker. So he talks about the deal he made with the MILF and with the NPA in Davao. So I think he thinks, like many other leaders, Pak Geun-hye, when she came to power in South Korea, do think that if you offered China a more conciliatory approach, you may gain something back from China that your predecessor did not, who in both cases, the predecessors took harder lines. So I think Duterte probably does, if he looks at his own personal history, does think, as many other leaders, including Obama when he came to power and talked about strategic reassurance, thinks if you give China face and don't focus on the territorial sovereignty issues between you, you can hopefully get something in return. I think both President Obama and President Park found that they didn't get back what they wanted and changed their approach to China. Duterte may be more successful or may join that group of disappointed olive branch offerers.
Interesting. We're already seeing some part of that. Your last thoughts. Thank you for all your insights. You're watching the Philippines and looking at this now. We've got 6 years of President Duterte. Last thoughts on the Philippines.
So we've had two months of basically of his administration.
Correct.
It's a lot has changed, and there's a growing number of questions. Hopefully, it'll calm down and become more predictable and a little less fun to watch from the outside.
Thank you so much. We've been speaking with Malcolm Cook. He's a senior fellow at the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore and also a former professor at Ateneo de Manila University. Malcolm, it's good to speak with you. Guys,
thanks a lot, Maria.
See you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.